Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, I want to speak to the quiet warriors in this room. The ones who love with their entire soul, the ones who feel everything deeply, the ones who show up without being asked, the ones who give without keeping score. When a super empath loves someone they can't have, the first thing that breaks inside them is not their hope, not their confidence, and not even their trust. It is their sense of clarity. Super empaths don't love casually. They don't fall for surface level charm or temporary excitement. They fall for soul energy, for emotional resonance, for intuitive alignment. They fall because something inside them recognizes something inside the other person. They see potential long before it becomes visible. They feel connection before it becomes tangible. They sense emotional truth before a single word is spoken. So when they cannot have the person they love, the grief they feel isn't just based on the present. It's based on the future they had already seen, felt, and emotionally prepared for. They don't just lose a person. They lose the vision their heart already believed in. They lose the emotional universe their intuition already built. They lose the possibility that felt more real to them than most people could ever understand. This is the kind of loss that shakes a super empath to the core, because their love isn't imagination. It's insight. It's emotional intelligence. It's spiritual recognition. When they connect with someone, they don't just see who that person is today, they see who that person could become, who they are beneath their wounds, who they are beyond their fears. And that depth of connection creates a vision. A vivid, detailed emotional future that feels just as real as the present moment. Losing that connection is like losing a part of their internal map, a part of their inner knowing, a part of their emotional truth. So the pain doesn't start with heartbreak. It starts with confusion. How could something that felt so real end up being unreachable? How could my intuition be this strong, and yet the timing be so wrong? How can I feel a connection that the other person doesn't know how to hold? Super empaths do not fall for illusions. They fall for authenticity, even when it's buried under layers of fear or avoidance. They feel the hidden softness in someone who acts distant. They feel the wounded inner child inside someone who acts cold. They feel the potential in someone who isn't emotionally ready. And because they feel all of this with such clarity, losing the person feels like losing a destiny that was emotionally promised, even if it was never logically spoken. This is why super empaths struggle more than anyone else. When they love someone they can't have, their intuition stitched together a future that their rational mind cannot simply erase. They saw moments that could have existed. They felt love that could have deepened. They sensed growth that could have unfolded. And when those things don't happen, their heart doesn't just mourn the person, it mourns the emotional path that now disappears. They begin questioning their internal compass. They begin doubting the connection. They start overanalyzing every small sign, every energy shift, every intuitive signal that once felt so certain. They wonder if they misread everything, even though deep down they know they didn't. But this is the cruelty of being a super empath. Their emotional sight reaches so far ahead that losing someone feels like losing years of unspoken possibilities. They don't just lose what was, they lose what could have been, and that grief is heavy, invisible, overwhelming. It's why others don't understand their pain. People say, "You barely dated them," or "It wasn't serious," or "Just move on." But they don't realize super empaths don't love by duration, they love by depth. Their attachment is not built on time. It's built on emotional truth. So when a super empath loses someone they can't have, they also lose an emotional vision that once made perfect sense to them. And that loss feels like falling out of alignment with their own inner knowing. It feels like stepping out of a world that was meant to be safe. It feels like being ripped away from something spiritually familiar, something they recognized before it even began. This is why it breaks them in ways no one sees. Because no one else saw the future they saw. No one else felt the depth they felt. No one else understood the potential they recognized with perfect clarity. And yet, the super empath must grieve a future that only they ever knew existed. That is the first wound. That is the fracture beneath the surface. That is the beginning of a heartbreak that unfolds in silence. When a super empath loves someone they can't have, the second wound that breaks them is the sudden collapse of their self-trust. Super empaths navigate life through intuition. Not guessing, not hoping, not fantasizing, but knowing. Their emotional sensitivity is not weakness, it's a finely sharpened radar that picks up on energy, Truth, micro-expressions, emotional contradictions, and unspoken feelings long before most people even notice a shift. They don't fall in love blindly, they fall in love because something inside them recognizes a resonance, a pull that feels deeper than logic, deeper than timing, deeper than circumstances. So when the connection doesn't materialize, when the person they felt drawn to cannot meet them, cannot choose them, or cannot reciprocate the depth they sensed, the empath does not question the other person. They question themselves. Their heart immediately turns inward and asks, how could my intuition be so strong and yet so wrong? That question becomes a painful echo inside them, because their intuition is the one thing they trust more than anything else. It has guided them through life, protected them, warned them, and aligned them with truth. But in love, the place where they feel the deepest, it suddenly feels like their inner compass betrayed them. Super empaths don't just doubt the connection, they doubt themselves. They replay every moment, every conversation, every signal, trying to figure out where they misread the situation. They remember the warmth in someone's voice, a softness in their eyes, a certain way they lingered in presence, the subtle intensity underneath their walls, and they wonder how all of that could be interpreted so incorrectly. They begin to think they projected love where there was none, depth where there was emptiness, intention where there was only confusion. They punish themselves for feeling too much, too deeply, too early. But here is the truth they cannot see in those moments of heartbreak. Their intuition did not lie. The other person simply didn't have the capacity. The empath sensed what was real inside that person, the vulnerability, the woundedness, the longing for connection, the emotional potential. They sensed the soul, not the behavior. They sensed the heart, not the fear. They sensed the person behind the walls. And that was real. The empath wasn't wrong. They were simply ahead of someone who wasn't emotionally evolved enough to meet them where they stood. Still, the empath doesn't know this yet. In their eyes, it looks like their emotional intelligence failed them. They start retreating inward, doubting their own gifts. They begin second-guessing future instincts. They lose confidence in their ability to feel truth. They question whether they manufactured the entire connection in their own mind, even though they know intuitively that what they felt was not imagined. But the pain forces them to challenge their inner authority. What makes this wound especially cruel is that super empaths connect with emotional truth, not surface behavior. So when the person they love pulls away, shuts down, or cannot reciprocate, the empath feels the contradiction. The connection was real, but the outcome is not. They feel the depth, but they cannot hold it. They feel the resonance, but they cannot claim it. They feel the authenticity, but they cannot experience it. This emotional mismatch creates a painful cognitive dissonance that fractures their faith in their inner knowing. Super empaths start wondering, did I misinterpret their signals? Did I imagine the emotional connection? Was I projecting my own feelings onto them? Am I not as intuitive as I thought? These questions sting because they cut directly into the empath's core identity. Their intuition is not just a skill, it's who they are. So when love doesn't align with what they felt, it destabilizes them from the inside. They stop trusting the feeling that has always guided them. They start shrinking their emotional perception. They become afraid to listen to their own heart again. This internal rupture can be more painful than the heartbreak itself, because losing someone hurts. But losing faith in yourself wounds you on a deeper level. In reality, the empath didn't misread the connection. They simply saw the version of that person who existed beneath the trauma, beneath the fear, beneath the emotional avoidance. They sensed the emotional truth, that the other person wasn't ready to live out loud. The empath felt what could be, not what the other person was capable of stepping into. But when you're a super empath, your heart doesn't differentiate between potential and readiness. It just feels the truth of someone's soul, and when that soul cannot join you, the empath blames their own heart for believing in something real. This is why the second wound, the collapse of self-trust, is one of the most painful parts of loving someone they cannot have. It makes the empath question the one thing they should never doubt: their own inner wisdom. It disconnects them from the very compass that makes them who they are. And yet, in this collapse, a new clarity eventually emerges. Because the empath learns that their intuition was never wrong. It was simply pointing to a part of someone that person wasn't ready to live from yet. But before that realization comes, the empath endures a quiet, private shattering of their self-belief. a heartbreak deeper than love itself. When a super empath loves someone they can't have, the deepest wound they suffer is not from rejection, not from distance, and not from the loss itself. It is the crushing collapse of their own sense of worth. Super empaths internalize love differently than most people. They do not ask, "Why didn't they love me?" They ask, "What is wrong with me that made them unable to choose me?" Their compassion is so deep and so instinctive that they turn every emotional outcome inward. They blame themselves for pain they didn't cause. They carry wounds that don't belong to them. They take responsibility for emotional failures that were never theirs to fix. This is the tragedy of the super empath's heart. They see the good in everyone, but themselves during moments of heartbreak. When the person they love can't reciprocate, the empath immediately assumes they were lacking something essential. They think they weren't interesting enough, attractive enough, calm enough, exciting enough, spiritual enough, stable enough. They fill in the blanks with every possible flaw. They take the other person's emotional unavailability as evidence of their own inadequacy. They see the other person's fear as proof of their own failure. They interpret emotional avoidance as rejection of their worth. But the truth is painfully simple. The empath's depth was never the problem. The other person's capacity was. Still, the empath doesn't see that. Their heart goes to war with itself. They question everything they offered: their presence, their tenderness, their patience, their intuition, their love. They ask themselves whether they loved too much, too deeply, too openly. They wonder if they came on too strong or not strong enough. They replay every moment through a microscope, trying to locate the fault, and every time they fail to find a logical answer, they assume the flaw must lie within them. Super empaths carry a lifelong wound of giving more than they receive. They are used to being the emotional healer, the comforter, the stabilizer, the caretaker. They are used to stepping in where others step back. So when someone they love doesn't step toward them, they internalize it as a direct reflection of their own value. They forget one important truth: some people cannot receive the love they offer, because receiving it would require a level of vulnerability those people are not emotionally capable of. When a super empath loves someone they can't have, the heartbreak comes layered. First comes the pain of love that cannot be fulfilled. Then comes the grief over the potential that never unfolded. But the sharpest pain arrives when they turn the entire emotional story against themselves. Their inability to be chosen becomes a personal indictment of their worth. They don't just lose the person. They lose the belief that they are lovable in the way they love others. They begin shrinking. They walk softer. They censor their heart. They silence their intuition. They try to become less emotional, less intuitive, less open, less deep, because they mistakenly believe that their depth is the reason they were not chosen. They do not realize that their depth was a gift, that their heart was a gift, that their intuition was a gift, that their love was a gift. The other person simply did not have the emotional structure to receive it. Super empaths also tend to attract people who are emotionally wounded. Avoidance, fearful partners, unavailable lovers, people who were never taught how to hold real intimacy. And instead of seeing the mismatch, the empath tries harder. They offer more. They love deeper. They stretch themselves thin trying to fill the gaps in the other person's capacity. And when that person cannot meet them, the empath takes the fall. They think, if I had just loved differently, maybe they could have stayed. They don't understand that some people leave, not because the empath lacked anything, but because the connection was too real, too pure, too intense for someone who is afraid of genuine emotional depth. So the empath absorbs the wound. They carry the rejection like a scar. They allow it to define them for a while. They question their worth, their gift, their heart. The breaking happens silently. No one sees the internal collapse. No one hears the self-blame looping in their mind. No one knows how deeply they are hurting, because empaths never want to make others uncomfortable with their pain. Yet beneath all of this self-blame is a truth waiting to be realized. The empath was not unchosen because they were unworthy. They were unchosen because their worth required a depth the other person had never learned to swim in. Their love was not rejected. It simply exceeded the emotional capacity of the one they gave it to. And when the super empath eventually sees this truth, the wound begins to close. But until then, the deepest break they endure is the painful lie they tell themselves that they were not enough, when in reality, they were simply more than the other person could hold. When a super empath loves someone they can't have, The world doesn't witness their heartbreak. There are no dramatic scenes, no visible breakdowns, no emotional outbursts that draw attention. Their pain unfolds in silence, quietly, inwardly, privately. Super empaths don't break loudly, they break softly, and that softness makes their suffering almost invisible to everyone around them. This is the fourth wound. Their heartbreak is hidden, unseen, and unspoken. No one realizes how deeply they are hurting, because they don't let their pain spill out into the world. Super empaths are the kind of people who protect others, even when they themselves are collapsing inside. They carry their pain with dignity. They smile through tears. They show up for others even when no one is showing up for them. They answer messages, support friends, give advice, stay strong, stay kind. All while their heart bleeds silently behind the scenes. They don't want to burden anyone. They don't want to appear weak. They don't want their vulnerability to make others uncomfortable. So they swallow their heartbreak in quiet doses, letting it sit deep inside their chest where no one else can see. They cry at night instead of in front of anyone. They break in their own room instead of asking for comfort. They journal instead of calling someone. They overthink instead of blaming. They retreat instead of exploding. They hold themselves together so others don't have to. This kind of heartbreak is invisible, but it is far more painful than any loud expression could ever be. When someone breaks loudly, the world rushes in. People notice. People ask questions. People offer support. But when someone breaks silently, they suffer alone. Super empaths suffer alone not because no one wants to help, but because they make sure no one ever sees how deep the wound goes. They sit with memories, not because they want to, but because they don't know how to let go. They replay every moment in their mind. The conversations, the unspoken feelings, the potential that never materialized. They revisit the smiles, the softness, the connection, the almost love that felt so real, but never became reciprocal. And every replay deepens the heartbreak. They are too proud, too strong, or too compassionate to show outwardly. This silent breaking is especially painful, because super empaths don't lash out at the person who couldn't love them. They don't accuse. They don't hate. They don't judge. Instead, they make excuses for them. They say, maybe they were scared. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe they didn't know how to handle love. Maybe they're hurting too. They give the person grace, tenderness, understanding, even when they themselves are unraveling. Their heartbreak becomes even heavier because they carry it with compassion toward the very person who caused the pain. Super empaths break quietly because their love is unconditional by nature. They don't regret loving. They regret losing. They regret the fact that the connection couldn't live up to its potential. They regret the emotional alignment that wasn't reciprocated. They regret that they saw something real, but the other person didn't feel ready. They regret that they gave their heart to someone who didn't know what to do with it. And they process all of this internally, where no one can hear their thoughts or feel their agony. People around them often think they're fine. They think the empath is strong, composed, emotionally stable. And they are, but strength isn't the absence of pain. Strength is the quiet endurance of it. Super empaths keep functioning. They keep helping others. They keep being the emotional anchor for everyone else. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they are trying to glue back pieces of a heart that shattered without sound. This silent suffering also makes them feel misunderstood. They think, if people knew how deeply I loved, they would understand why I'm hurting. But they don't tell anyone. They don't say how much it meant. They don't reveal how profound the connection felt. They don't discuss the emotional visions they saw for the future, so they carry both heartbreak and the loneliness of being unseen in that heartbreak. Yet the painful irony is this: no one realizes they're hurting because they've always been the strong one. No one asks the empath if they're okay, because they're always the one reassuring others. No one suspects their heart is breaking, because they've perfected the art of gentle, invisible resilience. This is why the fourth wound cuts so deeply. They are suffering in a world that thinks they're fine. They're bleeding inside a heart that never lets others see the wound. They are drowning in emotions no one knows exist. But this silent breaking is not weakness. It is the empath's way of honoring the love they felt, even in its loss. They hold their pain quietly, because they respect the depth of their own heart. They break in silence because their love was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be real, sacred, and felt in the deepest parts of their soul. When a super empath finally begins to heal from loving someone they can't have, the healing doesn't happen suddenly. It doesn't happen dramatically. It doesn't happen because someone new arrives, or because time magically erases the pain. It happens slowly, quietly, and profoundly, through a transformation that reshapes who they are at their core. This is the fifth keynote. Their healing is not just recovery, it is evolution. A super empaths don't just get over someone, they grow past them. They rise into a wiser, clearer, more powerful version of themselves, and the transformation is nothing short of spiritual. At first, healing begins with exhaustion. Not anger, not resentment, not rebellion. Exhaustion. The empath reaches a point where emotional giving becomes draining instead of fulfilling. Loving deeply becomes too heavy for their heart to carry alone. They finally realize that the connection they were holding together by themselves is slowly breaking them. This exhaustion is not weakness. It is awakening. The empath sees that their heart has been overflowing while the other person's has remained guarded. They see that unconditional love cannot survive on one side. And this realization becomes the seed of transformation. The empath then begins redirecting their emotional energy inward. Instead of trying to fix the other person, they begin healing themselves. Instead of trying to understand why the connection failed, they begin understanding their own patterns. They start asking different questions. Why did I choose someone who couldn't choose me back? Why did I give so much to someone who gave so little? What part of me believed this love was enough? These questions hurt, but they also liberate. Because once the empath sees the truth, they no longer romanticize the connection. They recognize that what they felt was real, but it wasn't reciprocated with equal emotional maturity. As they heal, super empaths begin setting boundaries where there were none before. They stop over-explaining. They stop over-giving. They stop over-investing. They stop carrying emotional weight that doesn't belong to them. This is one of the most powerful stages of their transformation, the moment they realize they have the right and the responsibility to protect their own heart. They begin saying no to situations that drain them. They begin pulling back from people who take but don't give. They become intentional with their energy, and for the first time, they place themselves at the center of their emotional world. This shift is radical because empaths were raised, consciously or unconsciously, to put others first. They were conditioned to fix, to soothe, to give, to understand. Healing reverses that pattern. Healing teaches them that loving others should never require abandoning themselves. Their intuition sharpens. They see emotional red flags faster. They move away from people who drain them sooner. They stop chasing potential and start honoring reality. They stop falling in love with what someone could be and begin demanding alignment with who someone actually is. Another powerful part of their transformation is emotional detachment, not the cold, indifferent kind, but the healthy kind. They detach not because they no longer care, but because they no longer want to carry someone who refuses to walk beside them. Detachment for a super empath is not the absence of love, it is the presence of self-worth. It is the moment they realize, I deserve someone who meets me where I am, not someone I have to pull into the relationship. This clarity is healing in its purest form. Their transformation continues as they rediscover parts of themselves that were overshadowed by heartbreak. They return to passions, to dreams, to creativity, to friendships, to self-expression. Their world expands again. Their soul breathes again. They are no longer orbiting around someone who could not hold their heart. They reclaim their identity, and with it their power. And perhaps the most profound part of their evolution is this: they stop taking responsibility for other people's emotional limitations. They realize they did nothing wrong. They realize they didn't fail. They realize they weren't too much. They realize that loving deeply is not a flaw, it is a gift that simply landed in the hands of someone who wasn't ready to receive it. Super empaths emerge from this process not harder, but wiser, not colder, but clearer, not bitter, but boundaried. They become the strongest version of themselves, not because they stopped loving, but because they finally learned to love themselves with the same intensity they once gave to someone who couldn't love them back. And that transformation is what makes a super empath unstoppable. Because once they rise from heartbreak, they never again give their heart to someone who cannot hold it with the reverence it deserves. When a super empath finally reaches the last stage of their emotional journey, the stage where they realize they were never too much, but the other person was simply not emotionally ready, something profound shifts inside them. This realization is not loud, not dramatic, not fueled by anger or bitterness. It is quiet, steady, and deeply clarifying. It is the moment they stop blaming themselves and finally see the truth with absolute emotional clarity. Their depth wasn't overwhelming. It was unmatched. Their love wasn't the problem. The other person's capacity was. Super empaths often love people who are wounded, avoidant, emotionally unavailable, or disconnected from their own feelings. Not because empaths are drawn to pain, but because they see what others don't. They feel the potential hidden beneath emotional walls. They sense the softness under the fear. They see the real person buried under layers of childhood trauma, old heartbreaks, and learned emotional defensiveness. And because they see this so clearly, they believe that love has the power to bring that version of the person forward. But when the other person cannot receive that love, cannot reciprocate, cannot step into emotional vulnerability, the empath internalizes the failure. They believe they were too intense, too emotional, too loving. They think they cared too much or asked for too much. They shrink themselves, thinking they should have been lighter, quieter, colder, or less invested. They try to mold themselves into a version they think would have been easier to love. This is where the deepest wound begins, the belief that their depth was the obstacle. But as healing progresses, they realize something liberating. Their depth was not too much. It was simply too deep for someone who had never learned how to swim in emotional waters. The empath begins to understand that emotional unavailability is not a reflection of their value. It is a reflection of the other person's history. Their love wasn't rejected, it was unreachable. The other person wasn't overwhelmed by the empath. They were overwhelmed by themselves. They weren't afraid of the empath's love. They were afraid of their own capacity to feel. They weren't avoiding the empath. They were avoiding the intimacy within themselves that the empath awakened. This realization is transformative because it separates responsibility. The empath finally sees what is theirs and what is not, and what wasn't theirs. The other person's fears, the other person's wounds, the other person's trauma, the other person's emotional limitations, the other person's inability to hold connection. None of these belonged to the empath, yet for so long, the empath carried them like heavy stones inside their heart. When the empath reaches this understanding, they stop apologizing for their emotional depth. They stop dimming their inner light. They stop censoring their voice. They stop shrinking their feelings to make others comfortable. They stop trying to fit into emotional spaces too small for who they truly are. They understand that their intensity isn't intensity, it's clarity, intuition, sensitivity, presence, honesty, and emotional intelligence. It is a level of connection most people crave, but few can sustain. They begin seeing that being the right person for someone doesn't matter if that person is not ready, not healed, or not capable of rising to their level. They see that the timing wasn't wrong. The readiness was. They understand that the fault wasn't in what they gave, but in what the other person couldn't receive. And something beautiful happens next. They start valuing themselves differently. They start protecting their energy. They start honoring their boundaries. They stop offering their heart to people who feel emotionally safer in distance. They stop pouring love into containers that leak. They stop trying to convince anyone of their value. They stop seeking validation from emotionally inconsistent people. Their self-worth returns stronger than before, because it is no longer dependent on being chosen by someone who didn't even know how to choose themselves. This final realization turns their heartbreak into wisdom. They no longer see the story as a personal failure, but as emotional misalignment. They no longer see themselves as broken, but as beautifully intense in a world afraid of feeling. They no longer chase love. They attract people who naturally operate at their emotional altitude. They understand that the heartbreak wasn't proof of their inadequacy. It was proof of their depth. And that depth deserves someone who doesn't flinch, shut down, or run from intimacy. Someone who doesn't confuse love with pressure. Someone who doesn't see vulnerability as danger. Someone who doesn't interpret emotional closeness as suffocation. Someone who does not drown in the empath's ocean, but finally swims beside them. In this final stage, the super empath learns the truth that finally sets them free. They were never too much. They were merely too profound for someone still learning how to feel.